Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Pioneering Pensions. For those who don't know me, my name is Stefan Lundberg, and I have a passion for pension. Today, we're going to look at the behavioral side of pension, and to do that, our guest today is Will Sandbrook, who's the Executive Director of Nest Insights. Will and I have a good long experience of pensions together, and therefore it's a pleasure to invite you here today to Pioneering Pensions. Welcome, Will.
Thanks, Stefan. It's lovely to be with you. Thanks for the invitation.
Before we go on, I just want to give a bit of message to the audience that we're trying a new technology today, but the idea is still the same. It's half an hour conversation between me and Will, and after that, we have a Q&A session. So when you get an idea or when you get a question you would like to ask Will, just type it in the chat as usual. And when we get to the Q&A section, Will and I will sort of deal with your questions from top to down. So Will, my first question to you runs about your sidecar project. I think many of the people in the call might not know what it is. So it would be good if you could explain what it is and why it is an important topic.
Yeah, definitely. So I'll kind of start with why. So a lot of people in the UK have what we would call kind of low financial resilience, and depending on who you ask or how you measure it, so the FCA thinks it's about 14 million people, up from 11 million pre-pandemic. Some work by the Resolution Foundation reckons 38% of people have low financial resilience, and that same work said that almost half of people wouldn't be able to fund the loss of their primary household income for more than 3 months, and 1 in 10 wouldn't be able to fund that for a week. So this is a challenge, and it's a challenge in its own right, but it's also potentially a challenge for people's ability to kind of build adequately for longer term financial goals like retirement. And so the theory here is that helping people build even quite small savings buffers can really help with this problem. And the evidence in the States, for example, suggests that even a really small savings buffer, $500 or $1,000, can really reduce people accessing their 401k savings early, for example. So there really is a kind of link through to pensions outcome. And so the work we're doing really looks at kind of how do you use the plumbing of the pension system, so kind of payroll deductions and kind of associated plumbing within the workplace to help people build up that short-term financial resilience through workplace emergency savings tools alongside their pension saving.
And you have done quite an intriguing pilot study where you worked with employers on this. And I know you got the data, you did the analysis. Can you tell us about the key findings from that pilot study?
Yeah, so that work's still ongoing. We're working with 5 UK employers piloting a sidecar savings tool, which is called JARS, and it's a payroll deduction savings tool. The unique feature of which is it also has a kind of automatic rollover in the background. So once you build up enough of a short-term buffer, those contributions start topping up your retirement savings as well. So it's still going on. Kind of what we published an interim report last year, and basically the sort of headlines of that are that so kind of firstly there's a considerable degree of enthusiasm around this kind of idea from employers. Employers increasingly recognise that they have a role to play helping their employees with short-term financial resilience as well as with their pensions. There's a lot of enthusiasm from employees. In one employer we're working with, 6 in 10 of their employees said they thought this would benefit them, rising to 8 in 10 among those who fit into the more kind of financially challenged segments. And so that's a really positive sign. But the much more kind of challenging component of this is that very few people actually sign up, kind of, often of the order of 1%, 1 or 2% of employees. And that's true in our trial, but it's also true in more or less kind of every other workplace emergency savings context that we've seen so far, or at least in all of those that require the individual worker to opt in to the savings tool. And so, a lot of our thinking subsequently has been on, well, okay, since people seem to want to use this, and actually the early sidecar data suggests those who do really benefit from it in a financial health sense, how can we address those low levels of take-up?
Okay. So how are you planning to deal with sort of the weak uptake that, as far as I understood, people say, wow, I really like it, but few are signing up. What is your plan going forward to sort of address that?
Yeah, so the focus at the moment in a lot of our work is on developing and trialing kind of opt-out models for payroll savings. So very much akin to pensions auto enrollment. Can you construct these things in such a way that kind of enables people, that puts people in a default and has them kind of opt out if they want to. So that's the kind of current focus of our work.
And if you do this, I can understand if I'm sort of an employee and I get the assignment, well, do you want to join this scheme? If you would do it in an auto-enrollment way, say that I start to work for the company who has this scheme, and they're going to auto-enroll me into my pension, and they're going to auto-enroll me into the sidecar. How would that work in practice? How do I go through it as an employee?
Yeah, so it's worth saying that unlike in pensions where there's a statutory obligation to auto-enroll workers, in the kind of emergency savings space, there are actually a number of legal and regulatory barriers to doing this on a kind of purely auto-enrolled basis. But those are barriers like sort of data protection legislation, know your customer legislation and regulations, anti-money laundering, sort of various regulatory disclosure requirements that are kind of overcome by the statutory obligation in the pension space, but still exist with other kind of retail financial products. So the way we're doing this trial, and come to a question of how it works for the employees, so that the employer we're working with for this trial, they have a digital onboarding platform for new employees, and it's how they get people to do things like sign contracts when they're offered the job, but before they join. So what we've been able to do is kind of modify that platform to capture some of the permissions and evidence of the regulatory disclosures that we need to make from those people before they start work. And they're effectively kind of permissioning us ahead of time to then auto-enroll them into the savings tool once they've started work. So then after that, they start work and they get auto-enrolled into the pension as per kind of anyone under the UK legislation. And then they separately also get auto-enrolled. They have an account set up for them, a savings account set up for them by the employer, and they get auto-enrolled into that, and the deduction comes out of their pay automatically unless they choose to opt out. And so that's the version we've been trying. So it's not what you would necessarily think of as pure automatic enrolment in the pension sense, because there is that upfront set of actions that the individual needs to take and permissions they need to give us. But nevertheless, the kind of early signs from that are really promising. So in the employer we're working with prior to the trial, new employees joining that firm were signing up to the existing opt-in payroll savings tool that they had, of the order of kind of 4, 5, 6% of new employees were signing up. And since we launched the trial, it looks from the early data like something north of 40% of new employees joining that firm since the trial started are staying in the savings tool. So really quite a considerable uplift. I think it's also worth saying, just for context around that unlike with pensions where the objective was always to get fairly close to kind of universal take up, we certainly don't think, and I don't think anyone else thinks, that universal take up of payroll emergency savings is the right goal. Lots of people won't need it. They'll be making regular savings kind of somewhere else in their financial ecosystem. And so we would think of 40% as probably pretty, somewhere in the kind of 30 to 50% range as feeling like a pretty good outcome. And so that kind of 40% from the first trial that we've done in this space looks really positive to us.
Thanks, Will. That sounds quite interesting. Thinking a bit about it, I mean, you've done a pilot for the way you have to opt in, and now you're doing a second one, opting out. Knowing a bit about pensions, I think both of us could probably say, why did you do the first one? Because it was kind of obvious that would happen. Why didn't you just move directly into this where people are sort of softly auto-enrolled into a short-term savings vehicle?
Yeah, so I think it's a good question, and I certainly share your view, Stefan, that the sort of low take up on the opt-in model was fairly predictable. I think there's a couple of things here. So the first one is if you go back through the kind of history of pensions auto enrollment policy, certainly here in the UK, a lot of really important work was done to create a formal, robust evidence base about why an opt-in model wasn't going to work as part of the basis for getting people over the kind of hurdle of wanting to do auto enrollment. And I think kind of something similar applies here, building the case in people's minds for why, if we're going to do this, it's going to require sort of soft enrollment version, not the opt-in version, with proper formal evidence and evaluation is really important. Not least because, as I was saying earlier, there are some real hurdles and barriers for employers in doing the opt-out version. And so they kind of have to really want to work, and what we found with the employer who work Suez Waste Management, who were working with on the existing trial, is they did really want to. They wanted to find a way to help their employees, and so they were willing to work with us, really quite hard on figuring out compliant and safe ways of doing this. And part of kind of the persuasion of why people will really want to is setting out that the opt-in version of this probably just isn't going to move the dial enough to kind of make a meaningful difference to people's to their employees' financial well-being. And then the other thing is we wanted to get going on learning some lessons and designing some tools, and it was always going to take longer to find the partners and work through the challenges on an opt-out model, and the opt-in model has enabled us to learn a huge amount. I mean, we've learned a huge amount about how people, although take up is low, we've still got people using the tool, and we've learned a huge amount about how they use it and kind of the ways in which it benefits them. So we think that work's been really valuable. But yeah, I mean, I think it was, we always knew that at some point this was going to need to end in some form of a stronger nudge towards using this than simply offering it and hoping that people will opt in.
And then additional question on that. I think for some employers it might be scary. Will this be fully legal, or can I get something coming back? If you would sort of give a wish list to DWP, who writes the law, whoever is sort of going to be overseeing this, what would be your wish list around making it legally easier for employer to sign up?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and I think we're still trying to understand kind of what we think might be needed and might help the most, and we're definitely still working on understanding what's already doable without any kind of change or clarification. But I think there are some interesting parallels. In the States back in the early part of this century, some of the same questions applied to pensions auto enrollment. Some firms were wanting to do it, but others saying we're not sure that that's allowed, and there were sort of steps taken in that case, legislative steps to clarify that it was legal. But I think even sub-legislation, there are almost certainly things that could be done on the regulatory side, just to issue guidance or support that employers and savings providers can reference to understand what the issues are that they need to be able to evidence and sidestep, just so that they've got kind of greater clarity that they're not doing the wrong thing. Interestingly, in the States, the financial regulator there has issued a template kind of helping to set out for employers what a compliant also safe proposition would look like. So that, again, in the spirit of trying to help employers do something which most people agree is kind of good and not intended to cause detriment to employees. And the more we can do to help employers have confidence they're able to do that, the better, really.
That sounds promising, and hopefully we will get some guidance also here in the UK. I would like to switch to another group, which is other self-employed. And I think it's a growing group. More and more people are self-employed. And unfortunately, they seem to fall between the cracks of the pension system as it sort of stands today. And you have been looking into this as well. What are your thoughts about this group?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to say is that this group, something like 5 million, depending on how you define self-employment, something like 5 million people in the UK are self-employed, kind of 1 in 7 of the workforce. But it's a hugely heterogeneous group in terms of its characteristics and its behaviours and its attitudes. You're talking about variation from kind of solicitors who set up their own practice through to the window cleaner who gets paid in cash, and there's not only variation around income and profession, but also really tangible variation around things like how do they manage their finances? Do they separate business finances from their personal finances? Do they use digital platforms like accountancy platforms and invoicing software, or do they use Excel, or do they use paper, and do they use cash? And so thinking about what might help these people to save more for retirement is a challenge in that setting. But I think it's worth saying, in total, kind of active participation in formal pension saving among those 5 million people is at about 15%. So we do need to probably think about and how to address that, because that feels like it's almost certainly too low.
Yeah, that's really an important topic. And if you're thinking about it, what are the current behavioral barriers for self-employed to actually get starting saving for their own pension? What are sort of the behavioral thing holding them back?
Yeah, so I think, the first thing to say is many of the barriers are the same barriers that were holding traditional workers back before we did auto enrollment, right? So inertia, the complexity of pensions, and the kind of fear of that complexity. There are lots of things that make it hard to start saving for your retirement, whoever you are and whatever kind of work you do. But then I think we do think there are also some behavioural and attitudinal and psychological barriers that are specific to the self-employed. And some of that is about what kind of asset classes they view as the best vehicle to plan for the future. That you get a lot of people in self-employed who think of their business and or property as the ways that they're saving for the future, and not formal pension saving. And kind of linked to that, I think that's at least in part because, of course, in the UK, formal pension saving is very illiquid. Once you put the money in a pension, you can't get at it again until you're 55. And we know with the self-employed that a lot of them face quite volatile and unpredictable income. And I think there's a real psychological barrier for people around, if you have a good month this month, you want to know that you can use that to fund having a bad month next month, rather than taking the surplus and sticking it somewhere that you can't kind of access. The other thing we see is that take up of things like ISAs is a little bit higher among the self-employed, and kind of average ISA balance is a little bit higher among the self-employed than they are for others, which we suspect is a sign that to some extent people are making provision for their retirement, but they're not doing it kind of through the formal pension system.
And Will, I remember you told me that you had done some research, or Nest Insights have done some research on interviewing self-employed and asking them how they're planning their retirement. When you did that research, what kind of struck you?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. I think one is that a lot of people in that group will absolutely self-identify as that there's something missing, right? So they sort of know they should be saving for retirement, and know that they aren't, and worry about that, but kind of feel that in some way it's kind of out of reach for them. I think the kind of second thing I'd say is, you do get a lot of people in these groups talking about their business and their property as their retirement strategy. And I think that in some cases is absolutely sound, but I think there's also often a degree of kind of optimism bias in there about how easy it will be to convert wealth that's tied up in their business or their property into income in retirement. And we know, people find it harder than they think they will to downsize. There's all sorts of issues around reverse mortgages and the extent to which those are a kind of viable product for people. And so, sort of often I think when you hear someone say, well, my property is my retirement, you worry that they may not have at least in some cases, a completely clear strategy for how to actually bring that into being. And I think the other thing we hear from a lot of people in this group is that they just plan to kind of keep working. But of course, we also know that whilst people tend to underestimate how long they'll live, they also tend to overestimate how long that they'll be able to work. And so, they may well end up with a longer period where that's no longer viable for them than they're expecting to have. And so, that kind of optimism bias kind of comes through again, I think.
Yeah. In the last episode of Pioneering Pension, Fiona Stewart had a question for you, which was concerning self-employed. But instead of me repeating that question, let's roll the tape and see what Fiona had to say.
I would love to ask Will what we've been talking about in terms of the self-employed. I think that's one of the challenges in the UK. And I know it's something Nest has been looking at, and they're always a very innovative fund. So I'd love to hear about the innovative ideas, again, these sort of behavioral economics ideas, linking savings to consumption rather than income, etc. What's the Nest team up to, and what are you thinking about in terms of how to get the self-employed into pension savings?
Thanks to Fiona for the question. So Fiona's absolutely right. This is something that we've been giving a lot of thought to. I have to say we haven't looked in any great depth at save as you spend and consumption linked saving yet, although I think it's a really promising area of focus. So we've been doing a couple of things. We've been doing some work that tests out, are there specific kind of messages that are particularly salient for the self-employed that can be used to promote kind of voluntary opt-in, and that includes things like kind of really highlighting the tax efficiency side of saving for retirement, and also highlighting that there's often more flexibility around how often and how much people contribute than they expect. I think that's one of the barriers we think for the self-employed. They tend to assume this involves committing to saving the same amount of money every month. And of course, it doesn't have to involve that. There are much more flexible ways that you can do it. So we've been testing some of those messages with people. And we've also been trying to think about kind of where are the platforms that the self-employed go to manage their money, where more kind of behavioural interventions might be applicable, kind of nudges. So that includes kind of pensions products that are specifically focused at the self-employed, but also things like open banking platforms where we're trying things like, are there particularly salient moments relative to when people have been paid or how much they've been paid that you can nudge them at that point to think about making a contribution to their retirement savings, or setting something up for their retirement savings. I have to say, I think across all this stuff, what we're finding is that there are things that are effective at the margins, and there are things that might be a bit more effective for sort of certain groups of self-employed than others. But there's nothing that we're seeing yet in this space that necessarily kind of moves the dial at the same rate as introducing auto enrolment for traditional workers move the dial. And so I think there's more to do, particularly thinking about the product attributes. So is the pension, as we currently understand it, the right product? And also thinking about interactions with the tax system and tax filing, where there may be scope to identify things that are kind of more effective still.
Yeah, one way might actually be to get inspired by the sidecar pilot and see if something can be auto-enrolled into it, even if you're not sort of employed.
Yeah, I think we certainly, or I certainly have a hypothesis that, so with the sidecar that we've been trialing, I think I mentioned earlier, kind of one of the features of that is that there's this rollover from the emergency savings account into the pension, kind of once the emergency savings account has a meaningful buffer in it. And I certainly think that concept may be particularly applicable to the self-employed. If you can get them saving into something regularly that isn't a pension, where they have the confidence that they can get the money back out if they need it, but they sort of pre-commit to, over time, if that balance does build and they start to accumulate kind of a wealth or an asset in that fund, that it kind of rolls over into something more long-term, like a pension that's designed to grow with retirement in mind and that kind of thing. I think that's definitely something that's worth thinking about. And I also think, as the digitization of the tax system and the higher frequency of information exchange between the self-employed and the tax system, I think also holds out some opportunity. And I think there may be a sort of version of auto enrolment that could be done within online tax filing that might create some kind of a nudge similar to workplace auto enrolment that could get more people in. So I think, kind of fundamentally with this stuff, I think if you think about what's worked so well with employees, it's auto enrolment and it's the mandatory employer contribution. So there's both a big nudge and a financial incentive. I think kind of models for the self-employed that recreate at least one of those, and preferably both. And of course, there is already a financial incentive for the self-employed through tax relief. I think those are the areas where we'll, if we're going to try and move from 15% to 50%, rather than just kind of increments at the margins, those are probably the places that we need to be looking.
Yes. And well, another topic which you and I discussed a lot is member engagement. And I find this term fascinating because it's used very liberally by the industry. So I was wondering, how do you define engagement, and what do you think about it?
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of definition of engagement, I mean, until we were sort of talking about this session, I'm not sure I'd ever thought that hard about how I would define it, and I probably don't have a very different definition of it to anyone else. And I think it's about kind of how actively and how frequently people are interacting with their pension savings, be that kind of seeking information or kind of updating their own details. It is just about kind of frequency and depth of interactivity with the product. But I think, and I agree with you. I think that the phrase gets thrown around. I think, to me personally, I think the challenge here is that I think sometimes our industry talks as if increasing engagement is an end in and of itself, is an objective in and of itself. And so we sort of do things where we measure click-throughs or registrations online as if the click-through or the registration is the dependent variable we care about. And so when we do a test and it moves that dependent variable, we're kind of pleased about that. Whereas actually, I would say that kind of from a fiduciary standpoint, what really matters here is financial outcomes in retirement. And so the dependent variable should really be, is this person saving enough to achieve an adequate income in retirement? And to the extent that engagement plays a role, it kind of primarily plays a role as a step towards those outcomes. And so the test should really be, when we get people to engage more, do they then do things differently, which actually kind of tangibly affect those outcomes? Because if although there is value in seeking information and those things, again, if all they do is kind of seek information and then go back to doing nothing else, and have you really kind of move the dial.
So a bit brutally, you can say someone who's actually been interacting, say, 3 times in their work life with their pension, but done important decisions to increase their or improve their outcomes, might actually be more engaged than someone who checks his investment portfolio 3 times per day.
Well, yeah, I mean, or if not more engaged, then certainly that would still be a preferable kind of overall outcome, right? So someone who kind of logs on once near the start of their savings journey and creates a monthly ABC of an extra £50 into their pension and then never logs on again, that's a really good outcome, right? I mean, assuming a bunch of things about that person, but that's a really good outcome. You mentioned the kind of logging on 3 times a day. So we spoke to a fintech investment platform who told us that they see this, right? They see people logging in 3 or 4 times a day to check the performance of their fund, even though they only update the unit pricing data once a day. So it literally the number can't move, between the first time and the 4th time that day that the person checks the number. And particularly in a kind of pensions context, day to day or week to week or even month to month volatility of the funds shouldn't be kind of that important. What should matter is the kind of return over the long term. And so you really do wonder about whether that level of engagement is in any way a positive sign, right? I mean, it's hard to see how that's kind of helping them, and it's probably just causing them anxiety, especially here in 2022 when that volatility is probably pretty high.
Yeah, and I was wondering if you would then I agree with you thinking and saying, okay, but how would we then design proper indicators for engagement? And how would we then measure meaningful engagement?
Yeah, and I think it's a really good question. And I think certainly, as I was saying before, I think the kind of if all you are measuring is click-throughs or registrations or viewership of a page, then you can quickly end up in a world where you think, the sort of marketing logic of what's the return on investment of a marketing intervention? Well, if X number of people click through, then we've achieved the goal of the marketing intervention, and then therefore it's okay to kind of spend kind of money on the marketing intervention. And of course, in the end, the danger of that is you sort of drive up the costs of the system because more people spend more money on marketing, and you don't necessarily have the track through to the end outcomes, and ultimately members are kind of bearing those costs through charges. And I think there's some evidence in other systems around the world where sort of marketing costs have got really quite high without seemingly in the end affecting the kind of quality of outcome that the saver or the end investor gets. So I sort of tend to think that the answer here is we'll kind of start, you work backwards from retirement income adequacy. So can you measure retirement income adequacy, and can you apply that measure over your membership in at least a reasonably segmented way, if not quite a personalized way? And then if you can test and learn engagement-led interventions, an email campaign to get more people to register online, for example, you can also at the segment level or the individual level measure whether in the end those people are doing things differently post the engagement, and then at least that the engagement measures that you're measuring are that you have an evidence-based belief that they're causally linked to the end outcome in some way. And I think that would be a kind of huge step on.
Thank you, Will. And I remember I had a conversation with Anna Maria Luzardi a couple of episodes ago, and we discussed around financial literacy and how that could sort of impact engagement. And I was wondering, how important do you think it is for a pension fund to increase the members' financial literacy in order to get them more engaged?
Yeah, so I think certainly I think in general it is desirable for people's financial literacy, but also their financial confidence and their financial awareness of their own financial situation for those things to increase. I think that's kind of desirable for lots of reasons. So it seems to me specifically on financial literacy, there seem to be sort of two broad schools of thought around this in academia, right? So one is if you look at people's actual financial literacy, measured financial literacy, and you look at their actual financial behaviors, are they saving enough for retirement? You tend to find quite a high correlation. So people with higher financial literacy tend to be engaging in more of the positive financial behaviors that you would look for. And so that school of thought would say, acting to improve people's financial literacy really will improve their outcomes. I think there's then another school of thought that says, well, actually, if you measure the effectiveness of interventions that are intended to change to improve levels of literacy, they often don't have much of a behavioural impact. So if you run a seminar or a programme, and you can measure that people's financial literacy is higher after the programme than it was before the programme, but then you look at, did they do anything differently as a result of that? Did they invest more or save more or borrow better or less or whatever? Then actually often the kind of behavioural impact is pretty muted. And so those people would tend to say, well, actually any evidence of correlation between pre-existing levels of literacy and pre-existing behaviours is probably driven by something else, which may well be underlying levels of education or numeracy or just wealth, right? I mean, there's all sorts of kind of hidden potential kind of variables there that could be explaining that difference. So in a way, I'd come back to what I was saying before about engagement. I think the same thing is true of literacy. Kind of people should be taking efforts to improve literacy if and only if they can show that the benefits in end outcomes that people experience outweigh the costs of the intervention. And financial literacy interventions can be quite costly. I'd also sort of slightly question to what extent it's a role for pension providers to be enhancing financial literacy versus some other kind of actor in the system, especially kind of given that cost. What I would say is I think there is some quite good emerging evidence around the whole idea of just-in-time financial education and kind of bite-sized education, where what you do is you basically wait until someone's in the process of making a decision anyway, and then you give them some kind of very, very focused, targeted, quick, just-in-time educational intervention in the hope that the decision they make right then and there will be better. But you accept that any lasting financial literacy benefit that intervention has will dissipate very quickly. So what you've done is to try to make sure that it holds long enough for that kind of specific decision. I think there is some evidence that can work quite well, and it's probably something that be good for more people to be trying kind of in the wild, as it were.
And then in practice, it means like if you are about to buy a house, you can get some information about how does a mortgage work, what I look for, etc. So, but that seems a bit outside the scope of the pension funds.
Sure, agreed.
So I think it's time to open the floor to questions now for you, Will. And I have a question here from Henry Tapper. He says, are the AVCs, additional voluntary contributions, to occupational schemes a comparator? Do you got data on voluntary take-up here, except that the AVC are targeting people with plenty of net disposable income? And was your experience of the FCA Innovation Sandbox helpful? So there's a lot of questions in there, so you can take them one by one.
Yeah, so hi Henry, thanks for the questions. I think I think this question pops up while we were talking about emergency savings. So I guess this question is, are AVCs a comparator for understanding kind of things like take up of emergency savings? So interestingly, if I've understood the question right, and Henry, please do sort of clarify in the chat if I haven't. Interestingly, in Nest, which has a relatively lower earning demographic compared to pension schemes as a whole, and a very similar demographic to the demographic for sidecar, right, as you sort of imagine. AVCs happen at a very similar rate to voluntary take up of sidecar. About 1% of Nest members make additional contributions of some kind. So certainly that would seem to suggest that people view being given the option to pay a bit more of their money over to something sort of roughly similar, similarly, whether it's directly to the pension or to sidecar, at least in terms of the number of people who do that. So in that sense, it probably is an interesting comparator. I think it's difficult because I try to be as evidence-based as possible, and some of what I'm about to say is definitely more my opinion than something I can yet evidence. Although we are looking at the evidence here, my sense is that in the end, if you can get the structure right, people are somewhat more likely to commit to save more into a pension if they're committing to it at some point in the future when they believe they will feel financially more secure. Right, and this, by the way, is exactly the logic that underpins Save More Tomorrow. People are much more likely to end up at 12% pension contributions if they start at 6 and you tell them you'll escalate them as their income goes up, than they are to go straight in at 12. And so the rollover feature of sidecar is based on that. It's based on the idea that if you say to someone who's financially struggling a bit or lacking resilience today, you want to put more money directly into pension, they're very unlikely to say yes. If you say, do you aspire to put more money into pension? But would you prefer to do that kind of only once you feel a bit safer in your short-term finances? There's a decent chance the psychology of that will fit well. Now, clearly, that hasn't been the case at the level of, that hasn't led loads of people to sign up for sidecar voluntarily, and there may well be other barriers to that. But that's I guess the sort of intuition that is in our minds when we think about this stuff. Has our experience of the FCA's Innovation Sandbox been helpful? Yeah, absolutely. I think it's probably true to say that we didn't exactly know what we wanted from them when we. So for context, our opt-out trial has been part of the sandbox, and we didn't really know when we applied to join the sandbox exactly what we were going to want or need from it, because we didn't really know yet. As much as anything, we were still mapping out what we thought some of the regulatory hurdles and barriers were. It's been extremely helpful to us having access to people in the FCA to help us pick through that and figure out kind of what the barriers are and which ones are more challenging, which ones less so. And what I would say is, as it turns out, a lot of the obstacles or sort of challenges in the way of opt-out payroll savings models are outside of the FCA's regulatory remit. That some of it's data protection, for example, some of it's contract law. And the FCA sandbox can only really help with the regs that the FCA owns. So while it's been helpful, it hasn't necessarily enabled us to kind of work through all of the challenges, but it's definitely been really helpful. Yeah.
Thank you, Will. We have another question from Jennifer Lee, which also relates to the discussion around the sidecar. She says, do employers also make a contribution towards employees' short-term savings in the same way as an auto-enrollment, or is it only the employee who saves?
Yeah, so this is a really good question and an absolutely fascinating topic, at least as far as I'm concerned. So the sort of factual answer is, well, it depends, right? Because unlike in pensions, there's no legislative requirement here. So in pensions, the employer has to make a contribution as part of the auto enrolment framework. In emergency savings, they don't have to offer it. And if they do offer it, they can offer it on whatever terms they want. Now, what we see with a lot of employers when we talk to them about this is they struggle a bit with the idea of offering a match into a emergency savings account, because that emergency savings account is 100% liquid, accessible money. And so in effect, offering a match into it is just a pay rise by another name, right? It's not even a deferred pay rise like in pensions, but just like an actual today pay rise. And I think a lot of employers sort of say, well, if we're going to give our employees a pay rise, we'll do it through the front door of a paid settlement rather than the sort of back door of a benefit. So I think there's kind of that dynamic at play. That said, I mean, we have seen here and elsewhere a couple of really innovative cases where employers have done something like this. So one of them we were highlighting at an event we ran a couple of weeks ago is an employer who is the University of Lincoln, who have a program where they employ a lot of students for certain jobs around the campus, and generally those students are under 22, so they're not eligible for pensions auto enrolment, and sort of even if they were, they're often only working for a few weeks, and so maybe the pension wouldn't be the best thing, but they felt as an employer that the fact that all their other employees had access to this pensions employer contribution, but these people didn't, wasn't necessarily very fair, and so the payroll savings product they've introduced for that group of their workers, they simply replicate the pensions match they're giving to everyone else into that. It's actually a Workplace ISA, the underlying product. So they're doing a match sort of structured exactly like the pensions match, and they've had huge take up of that and a really big impact in terms of how those student employees kind of feel about the proposition. So it does happen. I think Levi's in the States ran a program which had a sort of one-off upfront match. If you kind of, if you stayed in for 6 months, you got a kind of one-time payment into the plan, quite a generous one. I think it was $500. And again, that saw really high take up as well. And then the other, sorry, just I'll try and be quick, but the other thing I think is really interesting here, in terms of sort of potential innovation. So there's a really interesting case study in the States, nothing to do with emergency saving, it's actually with student loan repayment, where a company there recognized that one of the barriers for some of its graduate employees joining the pension was that they were trying to pay off student loans, which they can do through payroll in the States. I don't know if that's a general thing or specific to this employer. So what the employer said was, okay, if that's stopping you from joining the pension, then what we'll do is we'll match your student loan repayments, but our money will go to the pension. So you commit to pay off your student loan and we'll match it into the pension. So you are starting to accumulate some pension wealth, even though you feel you can't afford your own contributions to the pension. I think that's really interesting because it would overcome the employer, this is just a pay rise mentality. In effect, if you said to your employees, okay, you're doing your pensions contributions and that's great, auto enrolment or above, whichever. But if you also want to pay 1% or 2% into an emergency savings account, we'll do another 1% or 2% into your pension. And that is, I think, potentially certainly a model I'd love to find an employer who is willing to work with me on trialing it, because I think it's got real merit. And I just thought that example from the States was fascinating.
Yeah, I think it's a good example. And also, if you're interested as an employer, actually want to do a sort of sidecar thing, you might also be open-minded to put a little bit into it as well. Mm-hmm. Here's another question from I Am Bright. Would the removal of annual allowance for self-employed in savings for pensions be a sensible move given the potential volatility of the income? Still keep the lifetime allowance to allow similarity with employed and limited tax concessions?
Yeah, so it's not something that I've personally spent a lot of time thinking about, or that we've kind of talked about much within our research program. And my kind of immediate instinctive reaction to it is that kind of by and large, when we're thinking about addressing retirement undersaving among the self-employed, we're primarily focused on a group of people where the amounts of money involved aren't going to get anywhere near annual allowance, even if it's 2 or 3 years worth of contributions kind of bundled together because you've had a good year. But yes, I mean, on the face of it, I can certainly see the merits. I can certainly see the merits in the idea, or at least creating, allowing you to aggregate your annual allowance over more years So yeah, on the face of it, yes, I can see the merits. It's not something we've given great deal of thought to.
I have a question for you. I was thinking about the discussion we had about financial education and who should do it, because there's a lot of discussions today among master trusts that these sort of people want master trusts to do the financial education as well, or financial well-being packages. Do you think that master trusts are the right position to do that, or are there others who are more natural who will do that? And do you think employers will, in the future, if they want it, they will buy it as a separate package, which is not part of the pensions? What are sort of your looking into the future on this topic? And you don't have to provide factual evidence. I want your sort of gut feeling on this one.
Yeah, so my gut feeling would be on the financial education side, I guess a little bit my question would be sort of, what's the fiduciary, well, two questions actually. One is, what's the fiduciary justification for getting involved, right? So if you're the trustee of a pension scheme, what is the line of argument that you use to get to, we are going to provide financial education or literacy interventions for our members? You know, and I would say that argument presumably would be because we think they will get better outcomes at the end of it. And to me, at the moment, I'd be sufficiently skeptical of the evidence around whether those outcomes will actually change that much to worry that a lot of pension trustees might in the end struggle to get themselves over the hurdle of believing that was the right thing for them to do. My second thought about the financial literacy piece is that, you know, our pension schemes, like, do they have the right skills? What do we know as master trust providers that would make us good at improving people's financial literacy versus what some other actors might know, including, you know, in the education sector, but also you know, the guidance, you know, in advice and guidance kind of sectors, right? So again, sort of to some extent, you'd want the people to be who were doing this to be the ones who sort of knew the most about how to do it well. What I do think is on the broader financial well-being side, which can include, I think, sort of products like sidecar as well as education intervention, guidance intervention. You know, there is I think it's an interesting question about whether master trusts could do more in that space in the longer term future. Not least because the one existing payroll integration every employer in the UK has is with their pension provider, and you know, one of the barriers to any new payroll benefit is that you have to do more payroll integration work to install that benefit, and that can be time consuming and costly. So kind of question mark, could there be a role for master trusts in helping to facilitate access to a broader range of payroll based benefits, if only by using the plumbing of their existing payroll integrations, you know, to help provide their members with access to other providers and services around the system? Yeah, maybe. I think that is something that is interesting, and it's worth noting that a lot of emergency savings pilots and programs in the States are being delivered by pension providers because, again, they have that plumbing. They also have a pensions tax and access system that is more easily moddable to do that than we have here.
And I assume in the US, I recall that some of them are also just doing it as a separate saving aside from the pension fund, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Which is much more what we've been trialing with our work. You know, the fact that Nest Insight lives within Nest, the pension scheme, you know, so it's almost kind of a little bit irrelevant to this, because what we're primarily looking at and trialing and evaluating is savings account, payroll savings accounts provided by savings providers. There was one trial in the States where they used payroll cards. So they simply gave out debit cards to employees and loaded some money onto them each month and sort of branded them as for emergencies. So there's kind of all sorts of ways that you can do this.
Yeah, I think if there's a will, there's a way. I was wondering, with all the stuff you've been doing, and if you think about what's going on in the pension world, if there's like one wish you would sort of go to the DWP or the regulator, what would that be in order to sort of help developing products for master trust to actually be able to help people in areas which are slightly outside pensions?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure really. It's not, again, I'm not sure I've sort of thought that much about that, and I sort of, it's not necessary for me to kind of sit here and tell the government what it is I think they should be doing. I mean, I do think, kind of in general, a lot of this stuff that we're looking at is about employers in the workplace, and it's sort of tempting to just say employers should play more of a role in employees' financial well-being. It should go beyond just the pension, and expect that kind of over time they'll do that. And I think there is some pent-up demand among employers, particularly post-pandemic and with the current cost of living situation. Employers recognise that helping their employees be financially healthier is a morally good thing to do, but also likely to help with things like productivity and stress and things like that. So I sort of think in general, the more that can be done to give employers confidence and to signpost them to what options are available to them and the things that they can do for employees, and confidence that in doing those things they'll be staying the right side of kind of regulatory compliance and things. I think those are probably the things that would have the most value. But I think I'd probably want to think for longer about, if I had 5 minutes with the Prime Minister and one ask in the pension space, what would it be? I would want to make sure I use my time correctly.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest obstacles to innovation in our sector is a bit of what is regulatory allowed or not when things are on the borderline, because development costs are quite massive, and if you don't know if you're going to be allowed to do it or not, it's quite dangerous to spend a lot of money and time developing something just to realize it was in a sort of tight part of the regulation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I see a question coming in here from Alicia. So I know she's from PLSA. So yeah, so Alicia Harrington Clark, you mentioned flexibility and contribution for the self-employed, but how important do you think flexibilities such as opt-down will be for auto-enrollment in the future?
Yeah, so this is a good topic. We spent some time talking about this at the Work and Pension Select Committee when I was there, alongside some other master trusts giving evidence a few weeks ago. So I think that the sort of context for this is, on the one hand, there's a general acceptance that for a lot of people, minimum contribution rates under, or rather, I won't say minimum, I'll say contribution rates under auto-enrollment need to go up for the level they're saving to kind of achieve an adequate outcome. But on the other hand, there's at least an open discussion about whether that's true sort of for everybody or for enough of the auto-enrollment population, or whether there are groups, lower income groups, for whom actually 8% may very well be enough combined with their state pension to get them a pretty good outcome in retirement, and in particular may very well be enough in the context of other calls on their finances today, and in the context of cost of living and things. And so, to what extent, were there to be an increase in auto-enrollment contributions in the future, to what extent would the system also need to be changed to involve a bit more flexibility of some kind to try and ensure that you get the right people saving more without kind of forcing other people into some kind of binary choice between potentially saving too much or not saving at all? So opt-down is one variant of that, right? So this would be a model where you don't increase the minimum contribution under auto-enrollment, you increase the default contribution, but you maybe leave the minimum where it is. So people are auto-enrolled at 6%, but they can choose to go down as far as 5 or 4 without losing their entitlement to an employee contribution. Other flexibilities might be that you enroll everyone at 6%, but you leave a little bit of that money accessible in more like a sidecar structure for people rather than going straight to the pension. So I think my answer to this would be, instinctively, I do think building some kind of flex, if contributions are going to, if default contributions are going to increase in the future, then building some safety valves into that via some increased flexibility to try to make sure that that change works for everybody, not just the sort of upper half of the auto-enrollment income distribution. I do think that's important. I think which flexibilities needs a lot of further thought for two reasons. One is implementing auto-enrollment needs to be kept simple for employers. So you don't want to necessarily create, so one suggestion is that you simply increase the minimum rate for some people and not for others. That introduces a whole new kind of workforce sorting challenge for employers. So you want to do things that don't make this too much more complicated for employers. And the second is you want to avoid unintended consequences, right? So you want to avoid a situation where not only do all the people who perhaps should opt down, but so does everybody else. So I think the challenge is finding ways to test and build evidence around which of those flexibilities might be the biggest enablers to a general increase in future contributions to retirement saving. But instinctively, yeah, I think there's certainly an important role for some kind of flexibility or safety valve.
Thank you, Will. I think we're running towards the end of the webinar, and now you have been answering a lot of questions. So we thought it would be fair that you will be able to ask a question. And the person you're going to ask a question to is Steve Webb, the former pension minister in the UK. And he will be in Pioneering Pension on July 6 at 2 p.m. UK time. So, Will, what is the question you would like to ask Steve? Yeah,
thanks, Stefan, and hi, Steve. So my question was going to be, kind of obviously, one of the biggest changes in pensions policy landscape in the last few years was freedom and choice and removal of compulsory annuitisation, which took place during your time as pensions minister. And so I guess my question is really, so kind of with a few years now since that happened, kind of how do you reflect on it? How do you think it's going? Is there anything you would have done kind of differently about that policy with your time over, or at the very least, kind of how do you think it might or should evolve as the whole topic of retirement income in a post-compulsory annuitisation world? How do you think that might or should evolve over the next few years?
Thank you, Will. And I would like to thank you, everyone in the audience, for participating. I would like to thank you for your questions. It's been very interesting to see your questions to Will. And I would also like to thank you, Will, for actually coming here and answering all the questions. And I'm looking forward to speak to you soon again.
Yeah, thank you, Stefan. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, as I knew I would. So thanks very much for having me, and thanks to everyone for joining for the questions.
So until the next time, thank you, everyone.